There's a woman named Claire, 38 years old, working a decent job in marketing, earning about $70,000 a year. She has a credit card balance she's been carrying for 3 years, a retirement account she hasn't looked at in two, and a savings account that hovers perpetually around $2,000 before something always seems to come up. By most conventional measures, Claire is financially behind for her age and income, but Claire isn't worried. Not really. Because Claire's parents own a four-bedroom house in a desirable suburb worth approximately $800,000, a vacation property, and a portfolio of investments her father started building 30 years ago. Claire expects someday to inherit somewhere between $600,000 and $1 million. Not now, maybe not for 20 years, but someday. And that someday, quiet and distant as it is, shapes almost every financial decision Claire makes today, in ways she has never once consciously examined. This isn't a story about greed or entitlement. It's a story about a psychological mechanism that researchers have only recently started mapping carefully, and one that affects a much larger portion of the population than most people realize. The expected inheritance effect, as behavioral economists have begun calling it, describes a consistent and measurable pattern. People who anticipate receiving a significant inheritance systematically save less, invest less aggressively, and carry more consumer debt than demographically similar people who expect to receive nothing. The expectation of future wealth, even when that wealth is decades away and entirely uncertain, functions like an invisible permission slip that quietly authorizes present-day financial underperformance. Today we're going to look at why this happens, what the research actually shows, how the math plays out when the inheritance eventually arrives or doesn't, and why this psychological effect is arguably more financially damaging than most people expect, even when the inheritance ultimately does come through. Let's start with the scale of what's coming. Over the next 20 to 30 years, an estimated $72 trillion is projected to transfer from baby boomers to their children and grandchildren in what researchers have called the Great Wealth Transfer. This is the largest intergenerational transfer of assets in human history. Millions of people in their 30s and 40s right now are positioned to receive meaningful inheritances, and millions of them are, consciously or not. Factoring that expectation into how urgently, or not, they treat their current financial situation. For many of them, the effect is invisible, operating beneath the level of deliberate thought, as a background assumption that makes the present feel less financially consequential than it actually is. Here's the first thing the research reveals that surprises most people. The expected inheritance effect is strongest among people expecting moderate inheritances, not large ones. Someone expecting to receive $50,000 to $200,000, a meaningful but not life-changing amount, shows the largest gap in savings behavior relative to their non-inheriting peers. Someone expecting several million shows a slightly smaller behavioral gap. Perhaps because the amount is large enough that it triggers more conscious financial planning rather than background permission. The moderate expectation group, which is also the largest group statistically, experiences the effect in its most insidious form. Because the expected amount feels large enough to justify reduced urgency, but isn't actually large enough, once taxes, splitting among siblings, and the unpredictable timeline are factored in, to meaningfully substitute for a lifetime of consistent saving. Let's talk about what that math actually looks like. Claire's expected inheritance of somewhere between $600,000 and $1 million sounds like financial security. Here's what it becomes in practice. The estate goes through probate, which takes time. If there are multiple heirs, and in most families there are, the estate gets divided. Depending on the jurisdiction and the size of the estate taxes may apply. By the time Claire actually receives her portion, which might be 30% of the estate if she has a sibling, the actual check she receives might be between $150,000 and $250,000. This is still meaningful money. But it's a very different number than the vague 600,000 to million that has been operating as a psychological backstop for the last 15 years of her financial life. Now add the timing problem. If Claire is 38 and her parents are in their mid-60s and in good health, she might not receive this inheritance until she's in her late 50s or early 60s. At the very edge of her working life. The compounding runway available to that money is dramatically shorter than the compounding runway that Claire's own savings, consistently invested from age 38, would have had. $150,000 received at 60 and invested for 5 years before retirement produces a very different outcome than $60,000 saved consistently from age 38 to 65 and allowed to compound for 27 years. The expected inheritance doesn't just arrive smaller than anticipated, it arrives at the least efficient moment for compounding to do meaningful work with it. There's a second layer to this that the research highlights with particular consistency, what economists call the wealth substitution effect. Anticipated inheritance functions in most people's minds as a mental account, a reserve that already exists even though it hasn't been received. When humans maintain a mental account labeled future wealth, they draw down their present saving behavior in proportion to the size of that mental account. Exactly the same way people spend more freely when they have a bonus expected in 2 weeks, even before that bonus has cleared. The expected inheritance becomes, psychologically, a substitute for savings that haven't been made, not a supplement to savings that are already being built. This substitution is almost entirely unconscious, which is why most people who experience it will confidently deny that their inheritance expectation affects their saving behavior, even when the behavioral data says otherwise. Research from the Federal Reserve and from multiple university economics departments has documented this pattern repeatedly. Expected inheritances of $50,000 or more are associated with measurably lower household savings rates, higher consumer debt balances, and lower retirement account balances. Even after controlling for income, education, and family background. The effect size is significant enough that economists have started incorporating expected inheritance data into models of household financial behavior as a genuine predictive variable, not a footnote. There's a third dimension that nobody in Claire's family has discussed, because nobody ever discusses it directly. The inheritance might not arrive. Not because of malice or disinheritance, but because of the most statistically predictable reason imaginable: long-term care costs. The median cost of a private nursing home room in the United States currently exceeds $100,000 per year. The average nursing home stay is approximately 2.5 years, though many stays are significantly longer. A single extended care event can consume $400,000 or more of an estate before it even reaches the inheritance stage. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, roughly 70% of people who reach age 65 will need some form of long-term care. This isn't a rare edge case. It's the statistical baseline for what happens to aging wealth as people live longer. The assets Claire has been mentally spending in her head for 15 years may be spent in reality before she ever receives them, not in any dramatic or unfair way, but simply because her parents live long lives and require expensive care in the process. This is not a morbid scenario. It's the most likely scenario statistically. And it's a scenario that almost nobody who is quietly relying on an anticipated inheritance has genuinely modeled when they're making their own financial decisions. Let's return to what this means for Claire specifically, because the numbers here are not abstract. If Claire had started saving 15% of her $70,000 income at age 25, she would have been putting aside $10,500 per year into diversified investments. At 38, she would have roughly $230,000 in investment accounts, assuming historical average returns. Over the next 27 years to age 65, that existing balance alone would compound to approximately $1,200,000, even without another dollar of contributions. Instead, Claire has a couple thousand in savings and a credit card balance. The gap between those two trajectories isn't the inheritance's fault. It's the gap created by 15 years of reduced financial urgency, sitting quietly in the background of every small decision Claire made, powered by a number she imagined rather than received. What makes this particularly difficult to address is the social and family dimension. For many people, acknowledging that an anticipated inheritance has shaped their behavior feels disloyal, ungrateful, or even like tempting fate. The inheritance expectation lives in a psychologically protected space where it can't be examined too directly without feeling uncomfortable in multiple directions at once. You can't plan around it too explicitly without seeming to count your parents' deaths. You can't dismiss it too completely without seeming to deny a real family reality. And you can't discuss it openly with the people who will leave it, without the conversation becoming charged with emotions that have nothing to do with financial planning. So it sits, unexamined, doing its quiet work in the background of financial decisions for decades. The solution, such as it is, isn't to pretend the inheritance won't come. It isn't to resent a family asset that genuinely exists. It's to hold it in a specific mental category, a potential bonus, not a plan. The financial behavior that produces security, consistent saving, minimizing high-interest debt, building assets over time, needs to be built as if the inheritance doesn't exist. Because the inheritance's arrival is uncertain, its size is unpredictable, and the compounding math of your own savings is available right now in a way that no future inheritance ever can be. If the inheritance comes and it's meaningful, it becomes a supplement to a financial foundation that's already solid. If it doesn't come, or comes smaller than expected, or arrives later than the compounding math can use it efficiently, the foundation remains. Either way, you're not among the millions of people who quietly substituted an imagined future check for 20 years of present-day financial behavior. Claire isn't unusual. She's in a much larger and more statistically significant group than most people realize. A generation told, implicitly or explicitly, that something was coming, and who responded. Entirely understandably, and almost entirely unconsciously, by behaving as though it had already arrived. The damage isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like a savings account that hovers around $2,000, a retirement account nobody has looked at lately, and a very understandable, very human, very expensive feeling that the future will somehow take care of itself.